On the day a woman lost everything she thought to find her, she did not scream. She did not call anyone. She did not sit on her bathroom floor with a bottle of wine, the way people do in movies when their lives fall apart. She drove 4 hours north, alone, in a car that needed new brakes she could not afford, to a small white house in a town called Pine Hollow, where her grandmother had just died. And she sat down at a kitchen table she had known since she was 6 years old, and she opened a cardboard box. Inside that box, tucked between the flour-stained pages of a cookbook that had been sitting on the same shelf for as long as she had been alive, she found a receipt that should not have existed. A receipt for a farmhouse no one had spoken of in 80 years. What she found behind the locked door of that farmhouse wasn't just a building falling apart at the seams. It wasn't just an old cellar full of old things. It was a debt her grandmother had been quietly carrying since the Second World War, a promise made on a dark October night in 1944 to a man who never came back. And that promise had been waiting, patient and still, for 2 full generations for the right hand to finally keep it. If you have ever felt like the version of yourself you used to be has been slowly, quietly buried by the years, by losses no one else could see, by the divorce, by the job that disappeared, by the people who walked out the door and never looked back, stay with me. This story is for you. Part 1. When Everything Closes at Once. The lawyer's call came on the same week I lost my marriage and my job, in that order, 4 days apart. I want to be clear, I am not telling you this to ask for pity. I am telling you this because that is how the year had taught me to understand my own life. As a series of doors closing, one after the other, each click a little quieter than the last, until I was standing in a 1-bedroom apartment I could no longer afford, holding a cardboard box of office things and a wedding ring I had taken off in the elevator on the way home from work for the last time. I was 31 years old. I had no children. My career, which I had spent 6 years building from nothing, was gone by 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. My husband, who I had loved for 4 years and been married to for 2, had been seeing someone else for 10 of those months, and had decided, with the kind of calm that only comes from a decision already made long ago, that he would be leaving by the end of the week. And 3 weeks before the lawyer's call, my grandmother Eleanor, the last person on earth who had known me as a child, who had held my hand at 6 years old and taught me how to roll out pie crust, who had read to me on summer evenings on the porch of her small white house, had died in her sleep. The funeral had been small, a handful of women in their 70s and 80s who had known her from the church, a minister who was new and had never met her, and one man, a man with a white beard and a cane, who I did not recognize, who shook my hand at the graveside and said only 6 words before he disappeared into the crowd. "Your grandmother was a brave woman." He paused. He looked at me carefully, the way people look at you when they know something you don't. Braver than any of us understood. I should have asked him what he meant. I should have run after him when he turned and walked away. But grief does something strange to your legs. It makes them heavy. It makes the simplest movements feel like wading through deep water. By the time I thought to look for him, he was gone. Part 2. The Lawyer, the Key, and the Cookbook. The lawyer's name was Alistair Finch. His office was on the 2nd floor above the feed store in Pine Hollow, up a flight of stairs that creaked with every single step, the kind of staircase that announces you before you arrive and remembers you after you leave. The brass plate on the door had gone soft at the edges from decades of hands. The air inside smelled of old paper and furniture polish and the particular stillness of a room where important things are decided quietly. Mr. Finch had thin white hair combed over a pink scalp, a neatly trimmed beard, and spectacles he looked at me over the top of rather than through. His voice was dry and careful, the voice of a man who had learned that the most important things should always be said slowly. He told me my grandmother had left me the house in town. He told me the taxes were paid. He told me there were no debts. And then he paused. He looked at me over his spectacles for a long, deliberate moment, the kind of pause that means what comes next matters more than everything before it. "She also left you a box of personal effects," he said. "She was very particular about it. She asked me to make sure you opened the box yourself, alone, in her kitchen, with the cookbook she kept on the second shelf." Another pause. "She said you would know which one." I did know, of course I knew. The cookbook was a battered green one with a cracked spine that had sat on that second shelf for as long as I had been alive. "Joy of Cooking, 1953 edition, given to her," the inscription said, "by her own mother on her wedding day." I had not opened that cookbook in 20 years. I had not, until that afternoon, been brave enough to set foot back in her kitchen at all. Part 3. What was inside the box? The rain that afternoon was thin and mean, the color of dishwater. It fell on the slate walk in a drizzle that smelled of cold stone. The key turned in the lock with the same protesting click I remembered from when I was 9 years old, a sound so unchanged, so perfectly preserved, that for one impossible second I expected to hear her voice call from the kitchen. The house was cold. It smelled of cold concrete and stale coffee and a woman who was no longer there. The cardboard box sat in the middle of the kitchen table, the same table where she had taught me to read a recipe, to measure flour without spilling, to be patient. I sat down in her chair. I lifted the lid. Inside was a folded apron, a pair of reading glasses, a small black and white photograph of a young woman in a yellow dress I had never seen before, holding a child of perhaps 4 or 5 years old, a child who was not my mother. And beneath all of that, wrapped in a square of waxed paper, was the cookbook. I opened it. The receipt was tucked between the pages for pie crust and the pages for pickling, as if it had been hidden in the most ordinary place imaginable, so that only someone who truly knew the book would ever find it. A single sheet of paper, brittle and yellowed, typed on a manual typewriter, the ink gone brown with age, and at the top, in a careful handwritten line above the typed text, were words that made no sense to me at all. "Received this 14th day of October, 1944, for the property known as the Adler Farm." The typed text below it was a receipt of sale. My grandmother, Eleanor Marie Vance of Pine Hollow Township, had purchased 120 acres and a farmhouse from a man named Joseph Adler, on that date, for the sum of $1. I read it 3 times. I turned it over. I read it again. My grandmother had never owned a farm. She had lived her entire adult life in the small white house in town. She had been a school librarian. She had married my grandfather in 1947. She had been 21 years old in October of 1944. I had never, in all my years of knowing her, heard her speak the name Joseph Adler. I had no idea, sitting there in her cold kitchen with that brittle piece of paper in my hands, that what I was holding was about to change everything. Part 4. The Key and the Address. I was in Mr. Finch's office the next morning before he had finished his coffee. I held the receipt across the desk. I asked him what it was. He looked at it for a long time. He did not look surprised. He looked, I would come to understand much later, relieved, the way people look when something they have been quietly waiting for has finally arrived. "Your grandmother told me once that she hoped you would find this," he said. "She didn't tell me what it was. She only said that when you found it, I was to give you the key and the address." He opened a drawer. He set on the desk between us a brass key on a leather thong, worn smooth on one side by a thumb that was no longer alive to wear it, and an index card with a county road number written on it in my grandmother's careful school teacher's handwriting. "The property is 14 miles east of here," he said. It has been in your name since the morning your grandmother died. 120 acres. A single farmhouse, condemned in 1959, never reopened. The taxes, $5.40, were paid by your grandmother every January for 66 years. The last payment was recorded the week before she died. I sat with the key in my hand and said nothing. "There is one more thing," Mr. Finch said. "A development company has been trying to purchase this land for the last 14 years. Your grandmother refused them every year. Their most recent offer arrived in my office last week. They are offering $8,000, cash, closing within the week." $8,000? My rent was overdue. My credit card was at its limit. My car needed brakes I couldn't afford. $8,000 was a ladder out of the hole I was standing in. It was a way to walk out of Pine Hollow forever, to scatter my grandmother's ashes from the bridge over Hollow Creek the way she had asked, and to drive south to a city where no one knew my name or my failures. My hand was shaking when I set the offer down. "I'm not selling," I said. "I want to see it." Mr. Finch nodded just once, and something moved in his eyes that I couldn't name at the time. Years later, I would understand it had been relief. Part 5. The Farmhouse. George at the hardware store had known my grandmother for 60 years. He looked at me when I walked in the door and said, without hesitation, "You're Eleanor's granddaughter. Lord, you have her hands." He told me she had come in every spring for 60 years. Same 6 things every time. Galvanized buckets, wire brush, linseed oil, penetrating oil, 2 pairs of work gloves, a length of stovepipe. Every spring she drove out to that old place and worked the day, and drove back at sunset and never told a soul a word about it, he said. I asked her once. She said it was a promise she had made a long time ago to a man she had not been able to save. I could not speak for a moment. I stared at a row of paint stirrers and a tin cup until my eyes stopped burning. George loaded my arms with the same 6 things, took my money, and pressed it back into my palm. "Pay me when that house has lights in the windows again," he said. "Not before." The farmhouse was worse than I had imagined. The white paint had gone gray, and the gray had gone black. 2 windows on the 2nd floor were boarded. The wraparound porch sagged at the southwest corner. The barn had collapsed into its own foundation years ago. The north orchard was a field of bent, skeletal trees that no hand had pruned in 3 decades. The brass key fit. There was a long screech of metal on metal, then a solid, satisfying clunk, and the lock sprang open. I pushed the door, and it gave with a groan, and 80 years of trapped air washed over me all at once. Damp earth, rust, old paper, time. I walked the length of every room slowly. My footsteps echoed. Dust motes spun in the shafts of light falling through the broken windows. And with every step, I felt something I could not explain. The feeling of walking into a breath that someone had been holding for a very long time. Part 6. The Cellar. The cellar door was beside the pantry, small, painted dull green. It had a heavy iron latch and, tacked above it, a hand-lettered sign in my grandmother's careful printing. Cellar. Do not open without the key. The hinges screamed. The steps descended into a darkness so complete I could not see the bottom. I lit the lantern George had sold me and went down. The cellar was a single low room, walled in fieldstone. Shelves ran from floor to ceiling on 3 sides, lined with mason jars, preserves put up in a hand I did not recognize, the labels in faded ink reading dates from 1944. In the center stood a wooden table with a kerosene lamp on it, ready to be lit. Against the far wall, a cot, made up with sheets and a blanket and a pillow, as if someone had expected to sleep there any night for 80 years. Two framed photographs hung on the shelf above the cot. The first was a photograph of my grandmother, young, in a yellow dress, standing in front of this house in the summer of 1944. She was holding a child of perhaps 4 or 5 years old. The child was not my mother. The child was the boy from the cookbook box. The second was a wedding portrait, a bride and groom in European clothes of the 1930s, standing before a synagogue I would later learn was in Vilna. On the back of the frame, in pencil, in my grandmother's handwriting, were 3 names: Joseph Adler, Hannah Adler, Daniel Adler, born 1940. I sat down on the cot. For a long time, I simply sat. In the center of the table, weighted down by a brass paperweight shaped like an apple, was a wooden box the size of a small footlocker. My name was burned into the lid in careful, deliberate letters. Sarah. Not Sarah Vance, just Sarah. Inside the box were mason jars, 38 of them, packed tight with rolled bills, bound with rubber bands gone soft with age. $1,000 per bundle, 1 bundle per jar. $38,000. I sat down hard on the cold stone floor, and a sound came out of me that I had not planned. A laugh that turned almost immediately into something else. A deep, gut-wrenching sob that I had been holding in for an entire year. Since my husband told me he was leaving. Since my supervisor walked me out of the office. Since the call that Eleanor had not woken up. I cried until there was nothing left. And when I was empty and quiet, I looked back into the box. Beneath the last jar, wrapped in oilcloth, were 2 things: a leather-bound journal and a letter. Part 7. The Letter. The letter was written in my grandmother's hand, looped and slow and careful, the handwriting of a woman who had been taught that words were worth taking time with. Sarah, it began, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the cookbook has done its work, and you have come up the road to the house I have kept for you and for a boy whose face I have not been allowed to forget. In the spring of 1944, she wrote, when she was 20 years old and teaching school in the Hollow, a young couple had come to their church one Sunday with a quiet child of 4. They had come from Vilna, by way of New York, by way of a chain of strangers who had passed them from hand to hand across 2 years. The wife's name was Hannah, the husband was Joseph, the boy was Daniel. They were Jewish. Most of their family had been killed by then. They had bought this farm with the last of their money because a cousin had written that this part of the country was empty and quiet. They were there 6 months. In October of 1944, a man came down the county road in a black sedan and asked at the diner about the family at the farm. That night, Joseph Adler came to her family's house. He gave her father a leather satchel of papers. He gave her mother the wedding portrait. He gave Eleanor the brass key. He paid her $1 and signed the receipt of sale. And he told her if he and Hannah did not return within 1 month, she was to keep the boy as her own and never speak the family's name again. They did not come back. Joseph and Hannah Adler were arrested at a checkpoint in another county on falsified charges. They died in a federal detention facility in 1945, 11 months apart. Daniel, Eleanor raised in the farmhouse for 3 years. She told the town he was her sister's child. In 1947, just before her own marriage, a letter arrived from an Adler cousin in New York. 2 of Hannah's sisters had been found alive in a displaced persons camp in Germany. They wanted the boy. They were the only family he had left in the world. I sent him east on a train, she wrote. I did not see him again. He was 7 years old. He waved to me from the window. I held the wedding portrait in my hands all the way home, and I did not eat for a week. She had kept the farm in trust for 66 years, paid the taxes every January, driven out every spring to maintain it, waited for Daniel to come back, or to write, or for someone to come for it in his name. He did not. She had spent 40 years trying to find him. She had not been able. "I am leaving you this farm, Sarah," she wrote, "because you are the only person left to keep the promise I made to a man in my kitchen on a night in October of 1944. In the leather satchel under this letter, you will find every document Joseph gave me. You will find the name of a property attorney in the capital who has been helping me for 20 years. He has been waiting for your call. I have prepaid his retainer." And then, at the very end, underlined twice, "The foundation is the key, Sarah. The foundation is what kept the boys safe when the man in the black sedan came to the door. You are the foundation now. Build on it. Find him. Find him if he is alive. Give him his father's house. Your grandmother, Eleanor Marie Vance." Part 8. What she built. The next weeks were not dramatic. They were quiet, and they were hard, and they were exactly what I needed. I patched the porch. I cleaned the iron stove and ran new stovepipe through the chimney. I scrubbed the kitchen floor on my hands and knees with lye soap until the planks came back to the color they had been 80 years before. I called Mr. Henderson, the attorney in the capital. He asked me, very quietly, whether I had found the wedding portrait. I told him I had. He asked me to read every word on the back of the frame. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Good, then we know exactly what to do when they come for you. And they will come." The town watched me, and the town helped me. Martha at the diner left biscuits on the counter every Wednesday morning and refused to take my money. A retired electrician named Henry came up the driveway one morning in a pickup truck and wired the front room of the farmhouse and refused to take $1. An elderly woman appeared one afternoon with a covered dish and told me, in a voice that shook, that my grandmother had taught her to read in 1948 and she was sorry she had not come sooner. Mr. Henderson called back in February. He had found 3 things. The wrongful detention class settlement, never claimed, still on the books in the Adler family's name. A chain of correspondence confirming my grandmother as Daniel's legal guardian from 1944 to 1947. And, he asked me to sit down before he said it, a genealogy researcher in Boston who had located 2 weeks earlier a man in Tel Aviv. His name was Daniel Vance Adler, born 1940, Vilna. Raised, through age 7, by a woman named Eleanor Vance in a county he had not been able to remember the name of for 68 years. He was 81 years old. He was alive, and he had been searching for the same hollow my grandmother had been searching for him from. Part 9. The Final Offer and the Final Answer. They came in March. The offer from Oak Ridge Development had grown from $8,000 to $50,000. The letter mentioned, in language that worked very hard not to sound like a threat, demolition orders and public nuisance petitions and the difficulties faced by a young woman with no resources. The offer they slid across the table in Mr. Finch's office in April was $450,000. I sat with that paper in my hand for a long time. Long enough to let them watch me sit with it, long enough to think about a cardboard box and a brass key worn smooth on one side, and a boy of 7 waving from a train window. Then I set the paper down. "No," I said. I told them what I wanted instead. The farmhouse would not be sold. But I knew, my attorney had confirmed that morning, that their subdivision had been built on a drainage easement that ran across my parcel by 12.5 feet on a survey that was wrong. We could ask the court to compel removal. We did not intend to ask the court. Instead, we would grant the easement in perpetuity on 3 conditions. First, Oak Ridge would fund the complete restoration of the farmhouse as a community heritage center, with a permanent exhibit telling the story of the Adler family and every family like theirs that had passed through this hollow in the years of the war. Second, Oak Ridge would deed 80 acres along Hollow Creek to a new public trust to be managed by the township and open to every child in the county. Third, a scholarship in my grandmother's name would be established at the county school district, awarded annually to a student pursuing the study of history. The men in expensive suits looked at each other. Then they looked at the floor. Mr. Finch looked at me over the top of his spectacles. The contract was signed in May. They agreed to every condition. Part 10. The lights come on. I stood in the front parlor of the farmhouse with the first endowment check in my hand. I flipped the switch Henry had wired, and the lights came on, warm and steady, for the first time in 62 years. The tall case clock against the far wall was ticking. I had wound it that morning and set it forward 80 years, to 4:20 on a Tuesday afternoon in spring. Daniel Adler arrived in June. He came on a flight from Tel Aviv by way of New York. He was a small, neat man with hair gone entirely white and a face that had folded itself around the same gray eyes I had seen in the photograph on the cellar shelf. He had a daughter with him, a granddaughter, and a cane he didn't really need to walk but had brought because his daughter had insisted. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a long time. He looked at the door. He looked at the orchard I had been pruning since March. He did not speak. Then he climbed the steps slowly, one at a time, and he stood on the porch, and he closed his eyes. And he said one name, in a voice that had aged in 2 languages and carried 80 years of quiet grief in it. Eleanor. He said it the way a man says the name of someone he has been carrying inside him his whole life and has finally found the place to set down. Closing. The foundation. I stand on that porch sometimes now, on cold mornings, with coffee in my hand and wood smoke moving through the orchard. The Heritage Center opens to school groups 3 days a week. A photograph of a young woman in a yellow dress, holding a boy of 4, hangs in the entryway with a card beneath it that tells their story. The boy in the photograph is 81 years old, and sometimes, standing there, I think about the woman I was when this began. My inheritance was not the farmhouse, the promise someone made that you have not yet been able to keep. I read every single one. Thank you for listening.